The garden should have been silent except for the quartet. Strings hummed beneath the late California sun, guests fanned themselves with folded programs, and the smell of salt rode the breeze in from the bay. My dress brushed the stone with each careful step, clean matte silk that held its shape without fuss. Then came the laugh. My mother's laugh. High, brittle, and deliberate. She bought it off a discount site, she whispered to my aunt, but loud enough for 3 rows to hear. Cheap lace, at least the flowers look expensive. The sound rippled outward like a dropped glass shattering on tile. I felt the air shift. Guests tilted their heads, eyes flicking from the altar to my hem. A few even smiled politely, as though in on the joke. Silence followed, thick, heavy, unnatural. I heard a gull cry overhead, the faint whine of a jet passing North Island, the scrape of a shoe on stone. My heart knocked hard against my ribs. As I adjusted the cuff, my wrist brushed a stitched label hidden inside the seam. CHO Atelier, Pride Label, 1221, line 4. A tiny artifact, easy to miss, but not everyone in the garden would miss it. At the back, a woman in a dark suit stood quietly with a garment bag folded over one arm and a thin document tube in the other. Dana Cho, the designer. She waited, her bearing more like inspection day than a bridal showcase. My mother thought she had humiliated me. She didn't realize that the reversal was already in motion. What would you do if someone mocked you in front of your entire command? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. I grew up in a house that felt less like a home and more like a forward operating base. The floors gleamed like a barracks hallway before inspection. Furniture was aligned at right angles, magazines stacked with military precision. Even the air carried a kind of rigidity, as though it had been trained to stand at attention. Conversations at our dinner table never strayed far from 2 pillars, the Marine Corps and football. My father could recite casualty figures and game stats with the same reverence, and my brother Ryan thrived in both arenas. He was the natural heir, broad-shouldered, loud, and always ready to put on a show of strength. I, on the other hand, lived mostly in quiet corners. My world was books, maps, and long nights studying under the thin light of a desk lamp, in a family obsessed with appearances that made me invisible. My mother carried her own doctrine. Look expensive, never look weak. She treated every social event as an inspection parade. The measure of worth wasn't what something could endure, but what it projected to others. Her favorite phrase was one she whispered when she thought I wasn't listening. Value is what people think they see. I understood what that meant. To her, image was armor. Price tags were proof of honor. I was never comfortable with that creed. When I chose my clothes, I cared about durability, about fabric that held up through long marches, about shoes that wouldn't split after a 12-hour shift on hot tarmac. Even as a teenager, I gravitated toward things that lasted, not things that glittered. That tension between what I needed and what she wanted to show off was the backdrop of our every clash. I remember my senior year formal like it happened yesterday. I had saved enough to buy a simple dress, midnight blue, understated, one I could wear more than once. My mother intercepted. She rented a sequined gown 2 sizes too big and told me, "This is what people expect to see. Don't embarrass us." I wore it, feeling like I was drowning in someone else's idea of beauty. When it came back with a torn hem, she blamed me for not carrying it properly and made me cover the cleaning fee. The money came out of the wages from my part-time job at the library. That was the first time I realized the cost of appearances was always passed down the chain. Years later, as a Marine officer, I still thought about that night whenever I tightened a strap on my pack or laced my boots before a field op. Function always outlasts flash. A weapon isn't valuable because it's shiny. It's valuable because it fires when you need it to. That philosophy guided me in the Corps and in life. But in my family it was heresy. My mother was determined that my wedding, the one event she thought could redeem my plain sensibilities, would be her chance to shine. She wanted chandeliers, champagne fountains, a dress dripping with crystals. I wanted something else. I wanted a dress I could move in, stand tall in, breathe in. I wanted something built with the same respect I gave my uniform. Clean, functional, dignified. When I told her I had found a local designer who worked quietly out of a studio near Miramar, she scoffed. Never heard of her. Sounds cheap. You'll regret it. To her, obscurity equaled inferiority. In her eyes, if a name wasn't famous, it wasn't worth saying. But I wasn't looking for fame. I was looking for strength disguised as simplicity. That difference, the collision between her need for shine and my need for endurance, was more than just a family disagreement. It was the inevitable clash of 2 doctrines. Hers measured value in dollars and applause. Mine measured it in resilience. And I knew, even then, that the wedding dress I chose would become the battlefield where those 2 worlds collided. I didn't find Dana Cho in a glossy bridal magazine or on one of my mother's endless Pinterest boards. I found her name on a bulletin pinned to the wall of the Marine Corps Community Services office at Miramar. It was wedged between a flyer for a base blood drive and a notice about a family readiness workshop. In simple black text on cream cardstock it read, Cho Atelier, custom tailoring, uniform restoration, heirloom dresses, owned and operated by PR1 Rapport, Dana Cho, USN. Most brides wouldn't give that paper slip a second glance. But the words uniform restoration caught my eye. Anyone who can alter a dress blue jacket without disturbing its lines knows their craft better than most couture houses ever will. When I walked into Dana's studio, I was struck not by chandeliers or racks of rhinestone gowns, but by the clean smell of steam, starch, and fabric. Her workspace looked more like an aircraft maintenance bay than a bridal shop. Tools arranged with mechanical precision, spools of thread lined up like ammunition, bolts of fabric stacked in labeled bins. On the back wall hung a shadow box with faded parachute cord, wings, and a photo of a much younger Dana in her navy uniform. She didn't waste time with small talk. She took my measurements the way a rigger inspects a harness, brisk, efficient, with a pencil tucked behind her ear. Movement matters, she said flatly. You'll stand for hours, walk across stone, turn under an arch of swords. The dress has to move with you, not against you. I told her what I wanted, something simple, strong, and dignified. No sequins, no glitter, no fragile lace that would tear the moment a heel brushed it. I didn't want to shine under the lights. I wanted to stand steady in daylight. Dana nodded once, jotting notes. Matte silk blend shell. Minimal seams, reinforced hem for outdoor stone. Concealed tabs if they run you under the arch. She didn't look up when she added, "You'll need a lining, let me source something you'll respect." I must have raised an eyebrow because she finally met my eyes. Hers were steady, dark, and utterly professional. I don't do surprises, but some fabric has history. If I use it, you'll have to sign for it. Nothing classified, but not for resale either. You understand? I understood more than she knew. In my work as an intelligence officer, provenance is everything. A fact is worthless if you can't trace its origin. Evidence only matters if you can verify its chain of custody. Her words told me she treated fabric the same way I treated intel. She slid a clipboard across the table. The form was titled Archival Textile Use, Client Release. 4 lines of codes were typed in block letters. I signed at the bottom, my name printed neat and even. She tore off the carbon copy and handed it to me. Weeks later, when I tried on the first fitting, I understood what Dana meant by movement. The bodice fit like a flight suit, snug where it needed to anchor, forgiving where it needed to breathe. The skirt hung clean, not fussy, and when I turned in the mirror, the hem never dragged. I could imagine myself standing tall through the longest ceremony, shoulders squared, spine straight. Of course, my mother hated it instantly. She circled me like an inspector looking for flaws, her manicured fingers pinching at the silk. "It doesn't sparkle, it looks cheap." The word cheap rolled off her tongue like an accusation. "You'll regret this. Everyone will whisper." I didn't argue. I'd learned long ago that trying to explain substance to someone who worships shine is like briefing a map to someone who refuses to look past the frame. Instead, I said only, "It's within budget." Her laugh was sharp, practiced for an audience. Budget. Imagine my daughter's wedding, and she's quoting budgets like a quartermaster. Just remember, people won't see how much you saved. They'll only see how plain you look. I let her leave with her triumph, texting relatives about my discount gown. What she didn't know, and what I chose not to tell her, was that plainness isn't failure. Sometimes plainness is cover. When I looked back at the work order, my eyes drifted over the 4 coded lines again. Line 4 matched the label Dana had stitched into the inside seam, the one I'd brushed with my wrist during a nervous adjustment. I didn't look the code up. I didn't ask what it meant. I trusted her the way I trusted a seasoned NCO to know which rope would hold and which knot would fail. What I did know was this: the dress wasn't a costume. It was equipment. And equipment built by someone who once packed parachutes for aviators doesn't fail lightly. The first fitting was supposed to be a quiet milestone, a private moment between bride and maker. Instead, it turned into a battlefield. Dana had pinned the bodice, her hands moving with the precision of someone threading rigging through steel loops. The mirror showed me not as a bride from a magazine spread, but as myself, shoulders back, waist steady, the skirt falling without fuss. That was enough for me. It was never enough for my mother. She arrived uninvited, a gust of perfume and disapproval sweeping into the studio. "Well," she said, circling like an officer at inspection, "this is plain." Her fingers pinched the fabric, tugging at seams that had been carefully aligned. Silk without luster. Lace so thin it looks like netting from the commissary. "What did this cost you?" I kept my answer neutral. Within budget. That word budget was ammunition for her. She turned to Dana, who was adjusting a hem with the same quiet focus she'd shown all afternoon. "Do you usually cater to brides who cut corners, Miss Cho?" The tone wasn't a question. It was a dismissal. Dana didn't look up. "I cater to brides who want their dress to hold." It was a simple sentence, free of apology. My mother blinked, thrown off by the calm. But she recovered quickly, snapping a picture on her phone before sweeping out, already composing the narrative she wanted to broadcast. That evening, the family group text lit up. "Erica's gown is so simple. She's saving money for something else, I guess. At least the flowers will look extravagant." Comments stacked underneath, cousins politely saying they were sure it would look lovely in person, and aunt adding a thumbs-up emoji that carried more pity than support. I read the thread once, then closed it. My groom glanced over my shoulder, saw the messages, and placed a steady hand on mine. "Don't take the bait," he murmured. His voice was calm like the low rumble of engines before takeoff. "You're not playing for tonight. You're playing for the 4th quarter." He was right. I had spent years learning that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the one that matters. In the core, respect doesn't come from volume. It comes from consistency. My dress would speak for itself when the time came. Until then, silence was my tactic. Still, the whispers grew. At Sunday dinner, my mother dropped a casual grenade across the table. "Bring safety pins to the ceremony," she quipped, ladling potatoes with exaggerated cheer. Cheap hymns pop at the worst times. Ryan chuckled, shaking his head as if it were the funniest thing he'd heard all week. My father didn't laugh, but his silence was worse. It was the silence of agreement. I stayed quiet, chewing slowly, tasting the metallic edge of restraint. Every comment was another test, another attempt to push me into defending myself. But I wouldn't. Because what they saw as plain I knew was built for endurance. What they mocked as cheap, I knew carried weight they couldn't imagine. As the wedding drew closer, I focused on protocol. The chapel liaison confirmed guest seating. Senior officers would be placed left aisle, opposite family. The best man, a Navy lieutenant, finalized the sword detail for after the vows. "You'll need clean turns under the arch," he explained, tapping the back of his clipboard. "Your hem length matters more than sparkle." That single comment steadied me. It reminded me that in the world that actually governed my life, the world of standards, uniforms, and precision, flash was useless. Function was everything. On the eve of the wedding, my mother delivered one last parting shot. She stood in my living room, surveying the pressed dress bag hanging by the window. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "don't say I didn't warn you. People will whisper. They always do." I looked at her, then at the garment bag, its zipper pulled tight, concealing Dana's work. "Let them whisper," I replied evenly. It wasn't defiance, it was fact. She smirked, satisfied in her own way, thinking she had won. What she didn't realize was that I had already chosen my weapon, not words, not protests, provenance. And on the day of the wedding, the truth would be revealed not by me, but by the dress itself, and the woman who built it. The sun was just beginning to dip when the chapel garden filled with the low hum of voices. Rows of white folding chairs lined the stone patio, framed by palm trees swaying in the coastal wind. Beyond the hedges, the distant whine of Navy jets at North Island threaded through the quiet like background percussion. My dress moved clean against my legs with each careful step. The silk didn't snag, it didn't pull. It simply carried me. The processional began. Sword bearers in crisp whites took their places, hilts gleaming, eyes forward. Guests rose as I entered, their movement a practiced tide. And then, as I reached the front rows, my mother's voice pierced the hush. "Cheap lace never lies," she whispered loudly enough for an entire section to hear. The words were laced with a laugh, brittle but confident. Several guests tittered, the sound like glass chimes. I felt the sting, not from the insult itself, but from the ripple it caused. Heads tilted, shoulders shifted, eyes darted toward my hem, toward the bodice that, to them, looked simple, rather than lavish. But then I noticed something else. My commanding officer, Colonel Ramsey, seated left aisle with his wife, turned his head sharply at the sound. His jaw set, his expression tightening in a way I had seen before, usually when a junior Marine stepped out of line in a briefing. His wife's hand stilled on her lap, lips pressed thin. The officiant cleared his throat, shifting slightly. The string quartet faltered, the notes of Pachelbel trailing into silence. For 1 second, the entire ceremony teetered on the edge of collapse, balanced on the weight of one woman's mockery. I did what I'd been trained to do. I anchored myself. My fingertips brushed the inside seam where Dana's label rested, the stitched letters rough against my skin. I focused on my breathing, steady and measured, as if I were on the rifle range. The fabric didn't betray me. The dress held. Behind me, I felt my groom's presence, calm, steady, immovable. He shifted his stance just slightly, heels together, shoulders squared. A silent message, "You are not alone." But my mother wasn't finished. As I reached the altar, she leaned toward my aunt. "We could have had Vera Wang," she muttered. "Instead, clearance rack." The phrase carried, deliberate as a challenge coin tossed on a table. I saw Colonel Ramsey glance once more, his eyes narrowing. He didn't speak, but his silence carried authority. A few rows back, the best man, the Navy lieutenant coordinating the sword detail, shifted his clipboard under one arm. Even he had heard. And then at the far back of the garden, Dana Cho rose from her seat. She wasn't wearing couture or sequins, just a dark, pressed suit with a garment bag folded neatly over one arm, and a slim document tube in the other. She moved with quiet confidence, the kind of bearing that only comes from years of inspections and accountability. The chapel liaison intercepted her at the aisle, speaking in a low voice. Dana handed him a folded sheet, signed in black ink. I recognized it instantly, the addendum we had filed with the chapel weeks earlier. A pre-approved note allowing, at our request, a brief dedication during the ceremony. The liaison walked it forward, pausing at the officiant's side. The officiant unfolded the paper, glanced at me, and hesitated. His eyes asked the question silently. "Do we proceed?" I nodded once, slow and deliberate. The officiant cleared his throat again, but this time with purpose. "Before we continue," he said, voice carrying clearly over the gathered guests, "there is a brief announcement requested by the bride and groom." The garden shifted. My mother leaned back, confusion flickering across her face, though her smirk held. To her this was another performance, another stage. She expected a sales pitch, or a sentimental aside.
She had no idea that what was about to happen would unravel her carefully woven narrative thread by thread. The crowd settled into silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy, anticipatory. In that charged stillness, the balance of the day tipped, not toward mockery, not toward spectacle, but toward truth. And truth had been waiting patiently in Dana Cho's hands. Dana stepped forward with the same calm precision she had shown in her studio. She didn't bow or curtsy or try to soften the moment. She simply squared her shoulders and spoke in a voice that carried clear across the garden. "My name is Dana Cho. I served 12 years as a Navy parachute rigger. Today I am here as the maker of this gown. With the couple's permission, there is something you should know." The words cut through the air with the weight of an order. The guest's restless seconds earlier stilled. Even the gulls circling overhead seemed to fall quiet. My mother leaned back, arms crossed, smirk fixed. She expected a plea for applause, a defense of simplicity dressed up as sentiment. But Dana's tone carried none of that. It was the calm, factual cadence of someone delivering a maintenance report. "This dress is not plain, and it is certainly not cheap," Dana continued. "It was built the way I was trained to build equipment for aviators, functional, durable, and with a history worth carrying." She unfolded a small document from the tube in her hand, a certificate stamped and signed. "The lining," she said, her eyes sweeping the rows, "is cut from restored silk maps issued to naval aviators in 19... These maps were meant to save lives, folded into survival kits for pilots flying missions in the Pacific Theater. They came from the estate of a veteran, whose family gave permission for their use, asking only that they serve once more to protect." A ripple went through the officers present. They knew what those maps were. They knew the value wasn't in cost but in the story sewn into every thread. The hem facing Dana continued evenly, was trimmed with braids salvaged from retired Marine Corps dress blues. Uniforms too damaged for further wear, donated for restoration. Their material was unpicked, rewoven, and reinforced into this gown, not for decoration but for strength. My mother's smirk faltered. She shifted uncomfortably, but Dana wasn't finished. "The waist stay inside the bodice," Dana said, her voice steady. "Carries hand-stitched initials of 8 Marines who served with the bride on her first deployment. Families gave consent, asking only that their names remain close to her heart as she walks forward into this new life." The words landed like a formation marching in step. The garden, once filled with whispers of cheap and plain, now held only silence. Thick, reverent silence. Dana folded the certificate carefully and handed it to the officiant. "There is nothing about this gown that asks for applause," she said finally. "It is not meant to shine. It is meant to endure. Some things don't need sparkle to hold meaning." The officiant looked down at the certificate, then back at the guests. He read one line aloud. "Archival textile use authenticated. Families acknowledged." He closed the folder and gave a single nod. My groom squeezed my hand. My CO's chin dipped once, almost imperceptible, but I knew the gesture acknowledgement, respect. A lieutenant in the sword arch detail adjusted his stance, back a fraction straighter. My mother inhaled sharply, lips parting as if to protest. But before she could speak, the chapel liaison placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, his expression firm. It wasn't force, but it was protocol, a reminder that ceremony demanded decorum. The silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't heavy with mockery or expectation. It was the silence of recognition, the quiet shift of perception when arrogance collapses under truth. I stood taller, not because the dress made me look grand, but because it carried the weight of memory and endurance sewn invisibly into every seam. The whispers were gone, the smirks erased. All that remained was the knowledge that what looked plain had revealed itself as something unshakably profound. And for the first time that day, my mother had no words. The ceremony resumed, but it wasn't the same. The silence Dana had created still hung in the air, shaping every gesture, every glance. When the officiant asked us to exchange vows, his voice carried more weight, as though even he felt the need to honor what had just been revealed. My words came steady, carried by the strength of the dress, and the memory stitched into it. When the final blessing ended, the sword-bearers stepped into position, their blades lifted and crossed with clean precision, steel glinting in the late sun. As I walked beneath them with my new husband at my side, I felt the eyes of every guest on me, not appraising the cut of fabric or its lack of sparkle, but seeing the truth they had been forced to reckon with. At the last pair of blades, tradition called for the bearer to lower the sword until it tapped the bride's shoulder. Normally, the quip that followed was playful, even mocking. Instead, the Navy lieutenant leaned down just enough for me to hear. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "For those who carried you here," he said. Then the blade lifted, and we passed through. At the reception, conversation buzzed, but the tone had shifted. My commanding officer approached with his wife. He didn't waste words. "Captain," he said, inclining his head slightly toward me, then toward Dana, who was standing nearby with her garment bag. "Good work." That was all, but in the language of the Corps, it was everything. His wife added softly, "It was the most dignified thing I've seen at a wedding." My mother, however, was already scrambling to reframe the story. I overheard her muttering to a cousin near the buffet line. "It was just a misunderstanding. I didn't mean anything by it. People took it the wrong way." But even there, her voice had lost its audience. The cousin nodded politely, offered no comment, and turned to refill her drink. Later, she cornered one of the officers from my unit, trying to regain control. "Surely you understand," she said, her laugh brittle. "I was just making light." The officer's reply was calm, his expression measured. "Ma'am, ceremonies are for respect. We were glad the dedication reminded us all of that." Then he excused himself, leaving her standing with her glass half raised. She pulled me aside discreetly and knelt to switch the reinforced hem guard with a lighter one so I could dance without tripping. "Quarter-inch backstitch," she murmured, handing me a tiny sewing kit in case of emergencies. There was no fanfare, no victory lap, just competence, as quiet and steady as ever. As the evening wore on, the story of the gown spread through the guests, not with the speed of gossip, but with the gravity of truth. I saw Marines I had served with explaining to their spouses what a survival map was, tracing imaginary folds in the air with their hands. A Navy commander pointed out the braid at the hem to his daughter, telling her about the weight of a dress blue jacket. For once, I didn't have to defend myself. The evidence had already spoken. When the last toast ended and the music began to fade, Dana pressed a small brown envelope into my hand. "For you," she said simply. I felt the weight light but deliberate, and slipped it into my clutch without opening it. Meanwhile, my mother sat rigid at a table near the back, her smile fixed but brittle, her eyes darting whenever someone leaned in to whisper. For years she had wielded optics like a weapon, believing appearances could crush truth. But today, optics had betrayed her, because when the truth carries provenance, when it's documented, stitched, and authenticated, mockery collapses, and nothing she said afterward could change what everyone had already seen. When the last guest drifted out, and the garden lights dimmed, I finally had a moment to breathe. The dress was still intact, its hem unscuffed, its bodice firm, but the real weight I carried wasn't fabric. It was the small brown envelope Dana had pressed into my hand. I waited until the house was quiet before opening it. Inside was a folded letter in Dana's neat block handwriting. "Captain," it began, "the estate of Lieutenant James Carver gave permission for the use of his maps. His daughter told me her father carried them folded against his chest on missions he never spoke about. She said he wanted them to keep someone safe one more time. I thought you should know that wish came true." My eyes blurred as I read on. "The braid at your hem came from dress blues retired by women who broke ground when the Corps barely made space for them. Most were too worn to keep. I chose the strongest threads, rewove them into something that would hold. You walk with their strength now." The final paragraph was shorter, sharper. The initials inside the waiststay were stitched with the consent of families who asked for no public mention. They simply wanted their names remembered, not in stone but in motion. "Consider this gown their silent formation around you." I pressed the letter flat on the table, my fingers tracing the indents of Dana's pen. For the first time that day, the ache in my chest loosened. My husband came in quietly, setting 2 mugs of coffee on the table. He glanced at the letter, then at me. "Well, it wasn't supposed to be a spectacle," I whispered. "I just wanted to honor them." He nodded, his voice calm. "It wasn't a spectacle. It was a standard." That word stayed with me. Standard. In the military, a standard isn't decoration. It's what you measure yourself against. The dress, plain to the untrained eye, had become exactly that, a standard of memory, endurance, and respect. Still, the day wasn't finished with me. My phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "You embarrassed me today." I stared at the screen, then typed slowly, "I will not entertain commentary about my uniform, my work, or my dress again." Her reply came quickly. "You think plain is dignity. People will always whisper." I took a breath and sent my final message. "I won't trade endurance for shine." Then I set the phone face down and let the silence settle. Later, I returned to Dana's envelope. Beneath the letter was a copy of the certificate she had handed the officiant. Black ink on cream paper, stamped with seals, it was more than paperwork. It was evidence, a record that could outlast gossip, screenshots, or family narratives. My mother's laughter might echo in some relatives' ears for a few weeks, but this document would stand for decades. The weight of that truth steadied me. It reminded me of the intelligence reports I had written in the field. Dry, factual, unimpeachable. Reports that turned chaos into clarity. That certificate was no different.